Did you know that there were black people, historically, there were free black people that lived in New York that owned slaves? Did you know that? Are these descendants of these slave owners that are black, are they entitled to reparations? That's a question. All right, everyone. Thank you all for joining me on yet another video. I do have a great video for you all today, and I want to go over a recent update on reparations. So a California task force voted on Tuesday 5-4 to award compensation in form of reparations to descendants of slaves. So the decision was made to award this compensation based on lineage and not on race. So I'm going to unpack all of that for you all. I want to discuss this. And I want to talk to you guys about the issue that we're currently facing with this vote that just occurred on Tuesday and the issues that are currently looming on this. Because as you very well know, and if you've been watching my video around this, reparations is impossible to pay out when it's based on lineage. There are no black people, or there's no one black person that can prove lineage to slavery. There is not. Okay, I did a video recently around this, which I'm going to link to this video, and where I covered extensively why it is impossible to prove lineage to slavery, because we have no documentations. There are no documentations today that can prove or link anyone, any black person, to a particular person or persons in slavery. None. Okay, there are no historical documentation. There are no records. Even in the National Archive, we don't have anything that can. Which is why reparations has never and will never be paid on a federal level, okay, in terms of cash compensation, which is what a lot of the advocates of reparations are looking for. They're looking for a cash-based compensation. Okay, now the issue now is who is eligible, because according to the so-called ADOS, American descendants of slaves, who are advocating for reparations to be paid out based on lineage, none of whom can prove their lineage to slavery, because there are no records, there are no documentation, right? And so that's why on a federal level, this is an impossible task and something that will never be achieved. And so what's going on now is that a lot of states are taking this on, right? But even with that, most states, okay, like Chicago that passed a reparations bill, aren't able to prove lineage. Okay, they can't prove it. And so they result to really passing a program-based reparation, which essentially involves everyone, right? So I'm going to tell you the issues with this particular proposal that was just voted on Tuesday by this task force. Now, in addition to that, I'm going to also tell you why this task force isn't also able to prove lineage. Okay, even though they crafted this whole package based on lineage and not race, they're not able to prove it. Okay, they have no way of really coming up with measures that can prove lineage-based link, right? I'm going to also play an interview for you by the chairperson of the task force, who was asked on Roland Martin on his show, how can you prove lineage? And she could not answer the question. Okay, so I'm going to play that interview for you, because I think it is important for you to see it and hear it for yourself. That when you're basing compensation and discriminating against a certain group of people based on lineage, okay, and not on race, okay, it's an impossible task, which is the huge problem with reparations. Another problem with reparations is that the idea that of people who were never slaves are owed compensation from people who never enslaved them is a huge problem. Another point also is that no reparations has been ever paid in history to a descendant of any group. None. Okay? The Japanese Americans that received reparations, that money, the $20,000 they received from Reagan, okay, was paid to the victims that were involved and they were wrongly incarcerated in internment camps. They were not paid to the descendant, they were paid to the actual victim. Same thing with the German Americans during World War II. Reparations was paid directly to those victims that were affected. Okay? So there has never been reparation paid in history to a descendant of people in this country, which is another issue for this. Lastly, as it relates to California, okay, the problem with this reparation proposal, as it was voted on by this task force 5-4, which was a very close vote. So that's to tell you again how contentious this is. The problem with that is California was never one of the states that had slaves. They were not part of all the slavery back in the days. Okay? They were also not part of Jim Crow. Jim Crow laws were not extended to Californians or in California. They didn't practice none of that. So how is it that California is paying reparation for an act that was never conducted in the state of California? So that is another issue. So I want to unpack all of that for you all. And I'm going to also tell you the issues with this. More importantly, I'm going to tell you also why this is a huge loss for the so-called ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves. And I'm going to give you the facts why that is. And I'll give you my analysis at the end of the show. So we've got quite a few things to go through here. So let's get right into this, okay? Okay. So here is an NPR article regarding this. This was obviously released on Wednesday. So California group votes to limit reparation to slave descendants. So California's first in the nation task force on reparation voted Tuesday to limit state compensation to the descendants of free and enslaved people, black people, who were in the U.S. in the 19th century, narrowly rejecting the proposal to include all black people regardless of lineage. Now, the vote was split 5-4, and the hour-long debate was at times testy and emotional. Near the end, the Reverend Amos Brown, president of the San Francisco branch of the NAACP and vice chair of the task force, pleaded with the commission to move ahead with a clear definition of who would be eligible for restitution. Please, 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 I beg us tonight, take the first step, he says. We've got to give emergency treatment to where it is needed. Now, Governor Gavin Newsom signed legislation creating the 2-year reparation task force in 2020, making California the only state to move ahead with a study and plan, with a mission to study the institution of slavery and its harm and to educate the public about its findings. Reparations at the federal level has not gone anywhere, but cities and universities are taking up the issues. The mayor of Providence, Rhode Island, announced a city commission in February, while the city of Boston is considering a proposal to form its own reparation commission. Now, the Chicago suburb of Evanston, Illinois, became the first U.S. city to make reparations available to black residents last year, although there are some who say that the program has done nothing to right the wrong. California's task force members, nearly all of whom can trace their families back to enslaved ancestors in the U.S. Now, I want to know how they're able to do that. Okay? What measure are they using to trace their lineage back to slavery? Because it's one thing to say that. It's another thing for you to be able to prove that you're a descendant of a slave. Okay. Now, let me go back. Let me read that again. California task force member, nearly all of whom can trace their families back to enslaved ancestors in the U.S., were aware that their deliberation over the pivotal question will shape reparation discussion across the country. The members were appointed by the governor and the leader of the 2 legislative chambers. Those favoring a lineage approach said that a compensation and restitution plan based on genealogy as opposed to race has the best chance of surviving a legal challenge. I will disagree. Okay? I will disagree with that. So remember again that I said in my video that we cannot prove lineage. No black person can prove factually that they are descendants of slaves. Good? None. I know many people say they are, but there's no way for us to prove that, right? And so many of the ADOS advocates or reparation advocates by the ADOS individual, American descendants of slaves, are they're adamant that this needs to be lineage-based and not race-based, because they need to discriminate against other black people. They just don't want Caribbeans and Africans getting any type of compensation. Okay, so I want you to kind of remember that. Okay, but let's keep going. They also open eligibility to free blacks who migrated to the country before the 20th century. So I want you to put a pin on that. Okay, so they also open eligibility to free black people who migrated to the country before the 20th century. Others on the task force argue that reparations should include all black people in the U.S. who suffer from systemic racism in housing, education, employment, and said that they were defining eligibility too soon in the process. Now, civil rights attorney and task force leader Lisa Holder proposed directing economists working with the task force to use California's estimated 2.6 million black residents to calculate compensation while they continue hearing from the public. We need to galvanize the base, and that is black people, she says. We can't go into this reparation proposal without having all African Americans in California behind us. Now, but Kamilah Moore, a lawyer and chair of the task force, said expanding eligibility would create its own fissures and was beyond the purpose of the committee. Now, that is going to aggrieve the victim of the institution of slavery, which are direct descendants of enslaved people in the United States. So basically what they're saying is that if we expand this to include everyone, it's going to upset the so-called descendant of slaves who somehow believe that they are entitled and reparations should only be based on lineage and not on race. Okay. Now, the committee is not even a year into its 2-year process, and there is no compensation plan of any kind on the table. Longtime advocates have spoken of the need for multifaceted remedies for related yet separate harms such as slavery, Jim Crow laws, mass incarceration, and redevelopment that result in the displacement of black communities. Now, compensation could include free colleges, assistance buying home, and launching businesses and grant to churches and community organization, advocates said. So basically, there's no concrete plan on what this compensation would look like. So many are saying it could be free college tuition, which we currently already have for black people. It could be down payment, maybe an assistance for home purchase, maybe a down payment. We already have programs like that. So it basically is the same of what we currently have, right? However, it is being marketed as a reparations plan. Okay. Now let's keep going. Now, the eligibility question has dodged the task force since its inaugural meeting in June, when viewers called in pleading with the 9 members group to devise targeted proposal and cash payment to make whole the descendants of enslaved people in the U.S. Now, Chicago resident Arthur Ward called in to Tuesday's virtual meeting saying that he was a descendant of enslaved people and his family is in California. Now, okay, so here's what you normally would hear most of the time is that many people claim that they are descendants of slaves. But then the question now becomes, how are you able to prove that? Because anyone can say that. Okay? Anyone can say that. And the members of the ADOS, or those that are claiming American descendants of slave or claiming lineage to slavery, will often tell you that if you were born in this country but have immigrant parents, you're not ADOS. Okay? So how can someone who is born in this country, who clearly doesn't have an accent, who clearly looks American, what is stopping that person from claiming that they are ADOS? Okay? How can that person, prove that they are ADOS any more than someone who supposedly has no immigrant ties in their lineage? also prove that they're ADOS. But how can you prove that? Okay, because if you are claiming lineage to descend, you're claiming that you are a descendant of slave, right? Okay, no doubt there are descendants of slaves in this country, no doubt. But how do we know who they are? What documentation? There are no documentation. Okay, so basically, when this guy, Chicago resident Arthur Ward, calls in on Tuesdays claiming that he is a descendant of slave, what is he basing that off? Okay, what is he basing that off? That we can factually confirm that he is, like many others, are descendants of slave. Because I guarantee you there are no proof. Okay, but let's keep going. Let me read that all over again. So Chicago resident Arthur Ward called in to Tuesday's virtual meeting saying that he was a descendant of enslaved people and his family is in California and has family in California, I should say. He supports reparation based only on lineage and expressed frustration with the panel's concern over black immigrants who experience racism. Okay, so I want you to also pay attention to that. Okay, so this is black folks fighting black folks right now. Okay, this is what's going on. So there are black people on the left, okay, saying that, hey, I am a descendant of slave. That I don't want you paying any money to other black folks who are experiencing racism because we need to base this on lineage, which they can't prove, but somehow let's base this on lineage. Okay. Now, taking this long to decide something that should not even be a question in the first place is an insult. So this is what he's saying. California Assemblyman Reginald Jones Sawyer, who voted against limiting eligibility, says there is no question that the descendants of slaves are the priority. But he says that the task force also needs to stop ongoing harm and prevent future harm from racism. He said he wishes the panel will stop bickering over money they don't yet have and start discussing how to close a severe wealth gap. So basically, there's all this going back and forth. Okay, on who should be eligible. We need to exclude Caribbeans and Africans because they're not part of this whole thing. They didn't suffer the type of injustice that black people suffered in this country. So this whole bickering going back and forth, right? And so these guys says like we need to stop arguing about money we don't really have yet, right? Now we're arguing over cash payment, which I firmly don't believe are the be all and end all, he says. Now reparations critics say that California has no obligation to pay up, given that the state did not practice slavery. Remember I said it earlier on. Okay, now in California, most of the slave practices were in the South. So places like New York and California didn't really have slaves. As a matter of fact, in history, it was recorded that the number of slave ownership in New York was like 5%. It was very tiny. Okay, most of these practices of slavery and Jim Crow they all occurred in the South. So basically, critics of this are saying that California has no obligation to pay up, given that the state did not practice slavery and did not enforce Jim Crow laws that segregated black people from white people in the southern states. Okay, so let me break this whole thing down for you all so you understand what is going on. Now, on the point of lineage, here are the 2 points that I want you guys to understand first of all, because I don't know if you caught the whole confusion there. Okay, so this is a lot of confusion on this. So the first is that the task force, okay, limit state compensation to descendants of free and enslaved people who were in the U.S. in the 19th century. So that's the first point that I want you to get. So essentially what that means is anyone that was in this country prior to the 20th century, which began in 1901. You can prove lineage of anyone enslaved or free in this country prior to 1901 would be eligible for this compensation. Okay, so that's the first point. Now, the other point now becomes that they're also opening up eligibility to free black people who migrated into the country before the 20th century. Okay, so if you were in this country as a slave or you were freed in this country prior to the end of the 19th century, okay, or you migrated into this country prior to the end of the 19th century or before the 20th century, you qualify for this. Okay, so that's what the task force voted on. So now the question now becomes, is this lineage based or is this race based? Okay, because what this tells me right now is that not only is this lineage based, it is also based on a time period. So if you came from Africa, or if you migrated from any country, whether the Caribbean or Africa, into this country during the 19th century, you qualify for this reparation. That's essentially what it says, because if you migrated here, okay, you qualify. So you got that part. So that's exactly what that is. Okay. Now, this is a problem, because what this tells me is this is not solely based on lineage. This is also based on race and a particular time period. That's what this is telling me. Because if you're telling me that you're basing this on lineage, which by the way, you can't prove, is just basically taking you at your word. There are no archives or records that anyone can search, database, to prove this. Okay, so that's one huge problem. The other part of it is also that it's potentially opening up this to those from perhaps Africa or those from the Caribbean who may have migrated into the United States prior to 1901. Okay, so that to me tells me right there that this is going to anger the so-called ADOS. This is going to make them upset. Because what they have been advocating is an exclusion criteria where no one, who's an immigrant, black immigrant, should be considered when it comes to the discussion of reparation. They've been clear about that. Okay, this is why reparations has not been paid on a federal level. This is why it has not been paid, and will not be paid on a federal level. Okay, which is why many states are not picking this up. However, even the states that have devised a reparations plan have done it in terms of program. They haven't done it in terms of a check pay to people, which is what the ADOS and the FBI are looking for. They're looking for a check. So California, which many residents in California are arguing, why is California a part of a reparations compensation discussion? Because California, according to history, never took part in slavery. As a matter of fact, historically documented, most of all the Atlantic slave trade business and dealings occurred primarily in the South. Georgia, Texas, South Carolina, the Carolinas, Virginia. These are the places that conducted mostly slave practices. So the guys in New York, there were hardly anyone in New York that owned slaves. It was just I think it was reported that only 5% of the residents in New York owned slaves, which by the way included black people. Did you know that there were black people historically? There were free black people that lived in New York that owned slaves. Did you know that? Are these descendants of these slave owners that are black, are they entitled to reparations? That's a question. Because if we're going to be basing reparation off lineage, we also have to be truthful and also come to the facts that there were black people that lived in New York that owned slaves. Yeah. You didn't know that. I know this is something that was not put in the movie, so most black people didn't know this. Okay? So there were indentured servants that were black that became freed in the North and became free black men and women that walked around free, worked and owned businesses in New York that also owned slaves. Are the descendants of these people entitled to reparations? Okay, because it's a topic that we have to really come to realization on. Because if we're going to be basing this off lineage, we have to also address that question. Because the idea of black people owning black people is something that eludes a lot of black people. Most black people don't know this, right? But it's historically documented. that black people in the North owned slaves, which is why a lot of slaves in the South wanted to run to the North. Okay, there were two places in the North that most slaves wanted to run to, and also some of them successfully ran to. It was Canada, and it was also New York. Okay, because they heard of free black men and women like themselves that are somehow not slaves, and they were walking around free and enjoying freedom. And so they wanted to taste that freedom. So a lot of black slaves in the South were tried so hard to run to the North. The Underground Railroad was based off of this. Okay? Well, this is also why we had in history, the Fugitive Slave Act was written to deter black people from escaping to New York. As a matter of fact, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which essentially says that if you have a slave run to the North, the South says, if one of my slaves is seen in the North, you are obligated to return him or her back to me. Now, these over the years became very contentious between the North and the South, which is how the Civil War became. That's how we ended up in the Civil War, because the North, on one hand, were saying, it is not my business, and it's not my responsibility to police your slave or to police the idea of bringing your slave back to you. The South, on the other hand, says there's a law in place. You have to return my slave to me. And so there was all this back and forth, which is why Lincoln knew that the Union was becoming divided off of this. And this is what ultimately caused the Civil War that occurred in this country. It was because of that. It was because black people here learned of free blacks that were in the North, free black men and women, black people that owned slaves in the North. And so they wanted to escape to the North or escape to Canada through the Underground Railroad. And so based on this, the Fugitive Slave Act was put into law that ultimately resulted into the Civil War. So the Civil War was not fought because people were just trying to set free slave people. Lincoln wasn't trying to free black people out of the goodness of his heart. He was doing this because the North and South were ultimately at odds against each other over slaves. Okay, so those black men in this that lived back then, who have descendants that are living amongst us today, descendants who were slave owners, the black, are they responsible? And should we pay compensation to them? Do we even know who they are? Now that will be the question. Do we know who these people are? No, we don't. Any more than we know the ones that are claiming to be descendants of slaves. The point is that there are no records on file to identify which of these black people were slave owners, any more than there are records to identify black people that are with us today whose ancestry were slaves. There are no records, which is why the eligibility criteria based on lineage is a farce. Okay, it's not realistic. You can't prove anyone's lineage. No black person on earth today in the United States can prove that their great grandparents were connected to slaves. They can tell you that, but they can't prove it. So what the task force has done is basically created a false illusion about reparation being finally passed. And now they're basing it off of lineage. That's what they say. I think, if you ask me, I think the language of lineage was put in there to appease the so-called ADOS. Because they can't, none of the 9 members of the task force can prove their lineage to slavery. Okay? None of them. To add to this also is that the chairperson for the task force was asked in an interview on Roland Martin, which I want you to take a listen to this. How can you prove lineage-based connection on this? And she could not answer the question. She could not, because it's virtually impossible. But I want you to listen to this interview. And I want you to see her response when asked directly on Roland Martin, how can you prove lineage to slavery based on your proposal? And she dodged the question. She could not. So take a listen to this.
Kamilah Moore, she's the California Reparations Task Force Chair. She joins us from Los Angeles to explain this decision. Kamilah, glad to have you here. So the vote ended up being 5-4. That's a very close vote. What was the issue? Why was it so contentious?
Great question. So the community of eligibility discussion and debate has been kind of looming over the 9-member task force since we first started meeting as early as June of 2021. So we've been having a 10-month debate around eligibility. And the crux of the issue should the eligibility standard be defined by a race-based standard? So as you said in your introduction, all Black Californians being eligible for compensation for reparations for the institution of slavery, or should it be based on a lineage standard where if you can trace your ancestry to what we decided on, an African-American descendant of a chatteled enslaved person or the descendant of a free Black person living in the United States prior to the end of the 19th century, then you would be eligible. And so ultimately 5 people on the task force voted for the lineage-based standard and 4 voted for a race-based standard.
So based upon that, if somebody Black came to the United States in 1899, they make the cut. If they came in 1900, they don't make the cut.
Potentially. We still have to work all those details out, but that's what it says.
So now here's the issue. How are you going to prove it? How will people be able to trace it? Because what we know is you don't necessarily have clearly defined records for people to be able to search their lineage. So how are you going to do it?
So that's a really great question. But first, before I answer that question, I think that oftentimes people don't ask the same question about how do you prove your Blackness, right? And how do you measure Blackness? How do you prove it? So what's to stop someone like a Rachel Dolezal or Mindy Kaling's brother, who's of Indian descent, who actually wrote a book about how he pretended to be Black to get into medical school? How do you determine who's Black, and why would we be comfortable with the state making those particular determinations? But to answer your question about lineage tracing, when you talk about international law and reparations under international law, one of those tenets is restitution. How do you make a person whole after the state has harmed you? And so the state has a responsibility. If they've broken part of your lineage or your history, they have the duty and the responsibility to repair that. So what does that look like practically? That could look like the state subpoenaing the Mormon Church for records, and assisting people for free for lineage tracing and things like that. So there's no burden or financial cost for anyone who may be eligible.
So you see that, right? Roland Martin says you don't have a database for you to have people search their lineage. So how are you able to prove this? So to everyone that goes around saying that I am a descendant of slave, of course, because everyone wants to claim that they are descendants of slaves. But the real question is, if you're going to base reparation compensation on lineage, you somehow will need to be able to prove that you are. Otherwise, anyone can get it. Anyone can go and claim that they are descendants of slaves. So you have to have a mechanism or a measure in place to be able to prove this. And the real answer to that question is you cannot. You can't prove it. So how are you basing reparation compensation on lineage that you cannot prove, that no one in the United States, no Black person or a mixed person or anyone who is claiming that they are descendants of slaves, none of them can prove lineage to that? Then how are you able to base compensation off of that? Okay, so that is a problem. And I'm going to tell you why they're doing this. Okay, so that is huge. So she could not answer that question, and she just kind of danced around it, and she couldn't answer the question. She can prove that she is a descendant of slave. None of the 9 task force members can prove that they are descendants of slave. They can tell you this all day, that they are. They can't prove it. They can't. None of them can prove it. So understand this very well, that when you are from the Caribbean or when you're from Africa and you have these, anti-immigrant or anti-African, basically attacking you and saying that you are not part of the ADOS family, the question that becomes is, how can they prove that they are? Because they cannot. There is no database to prove this. Okay, which is why reparation on a federal level is impossible to do. Not to mention that state of California, who conducted a study. Okay, I want you to see this. There was a recent survey. Okay, the Associated Press already did this before, which in my other video I showed you how most Americans were opposed and still are opposed to reparations given to anyone. And I listed a list of reasons why many are opposed to it. Okay, one of which is the idea of paying descendants of slaves, people that were never slaves, money, okay, by people. So people that never owned slave paying money to people that were never slave, it's not right. Okay, there's no way you can justify that morally. Okay, so here's a. Do you agree with Newsom's plan to give reparations to Black Californians? So here's the result of that. Okay, 15% of people say yes, while 85% of people say no. So most people are opposed to this. Okay, most people are opposed to it. So the argument you're going to hear is that why should we pay reparations to people that were never slaves and we never owned slaves? This is the argument you're going to hear primarily from white people. Additionally, another argument is that the soldiers that fought and died for the freedom of black people, to set black people free, should those families be given reparations? That is another argument. Okay, those soldiers that died in the Civil War to set black people free, should they also get reparation? Okay, so you can kind of see how this becomes very, very contentious. The idea of excluding people, okay, based on race is, to me, an immoral act. Okay, it's not any different from what black people fought against as it relates to the KKK and the Nazis. The idea of supreme race over another, which is essentially what this is discrimination against on the basis of race, on the basis of ethnicity. We call that racism. When you deny someone on the basis of you deny someone economic opportunity, it's called racism. So now we're seeing a reparations proposal by California task force passed on the basis of race. Okay, so understand what's going on here. Understand what is happening here. What this has done and what this is going to create is a divide between the black community. A divide. Okay, the black community is already divided. So this is what this is going to cause. It's causing and it's going to cause a divide, because essentially what you're saying is that other people from other countries somehow didn't suffer and were not denied housing. They were not denied opportunities. They were not denied economic opportunities based on their race. That is a lie and that is false. But that's essentially what this is that we're going to base it off of a time period, because we're saying that African Americans suffered so much during this time period and many others did not. And so we can't morally give money to people that didn't suffer. That is factually incorrect. That is factually incorrect. Okay? Because during the 60s, there were immigrants in this country from other countries. During the Jim Crow era, there were immigrants in this country. Okay? So understand that that's what's going on. That the task force have successfully done nothing, essentially, but create what's called a symbolic type of activity. This is more symbolic than it is going to be a realistic solution. It's more symbolic. That brings me to why they're doing this. So why now? Why are they doing this? I'll tell you why they're doing this. It's because we're in a midterm election. Okay? We're in a midterm election. And the conversation of reparation has been going on far too long. I mentioned in my previous video that we get this conversation usually during midterm and election and presidential election. So Democrat states like California, like Chicago, okay, have to somehow create an impression, a false illusion for black people that they're doing something about reparation. Okay, and this is just only going to amount to another program. It is not going to become a cash-based reparations like most ADOS are looking for. That's not what it's going to become. So you hear a lot of conversation around, or we're still working around or working on what the compensation plan will look like. It's not going to be cash. It's never going to be cash. It's not going to happen. Taxpayers ain't going to foot the bill for this. It's not going to happen. So it's going to be a program like we already have. But here is the point I'm trying to make you understand. They're creating this false illusion to give the notion that they're doing something about reparation when they actually are not going to do anything about it. Because under the criteria in which a lot of these so-called ADOS are asking for reparation to be based on, not only violates the Civil Rights Act, as I mentioned in my previous video, it's also impossible for any so-called descendant of slave to prove lineage. They can't prove it. So how are you supposed to pay out reparation or provide compensation to someone who isn't able to prove lineage? We have to take you at your word? Essentially, is that what it is? So if that's the case, then many can also opt in and say, hey, I am a descendant of slaves. Correct. So that is a flawed system, and that is flawed. And there's no way that can ever go anywhere. So that is a huge problem with this, which is why I say that this is a loss for the so-called American descendant of slaves who are looking for somehow a compensation package in form of payment to them. We don't have that in this vote. They haven't put together anything else. And I will argue that they will never have anything in terms of that. So they have to create an illusion that something will be done, and they probably won't do anything. They might propose something close to the election so you can go vote, but right after the election, it'll fall right back to where it was. There's nothing going to be done. There's no cash incentive. There hasn't been one yet. Not in Chicago, and it's not going to happen in California, and it's not going to happen in Boston. Which is why reparation is being considered on a state level. But again, the descendants of slaves and the FBAs and all of these people are looking for they're looking for a federal mandate, and it will never happen. Let me know your thought on this. Okay, let me know your thought on this situation. I think this is more symbolic. I think this is much more of a fluff. This doesn't have teeth. It's more of an illusion of something being done than it is actually something really being done as it relates to reparations. Okay, if they have to do a cash reparation, they have to give it to everyone in California. Okay, California is one of the states that are giving out continuous stimulus, okay, to everyone else. California is giving out money, free money to people. I mean, isn't California already in a deficit? Don't they have a huge economic problem? I mean, everyone has left California. Is there anyone still in California? Okay, California has had one of the highest income tax, 13% in the nation. Okay, housing cost in California is through the roof. Many people, Elon Musk and many like him, have left California based on the ridiculous taxes in California. So I think this is just more of a way to try to halt the bleeding in California and people leaving California, and try to keep black people in California and also get them excited with the illusion that they're going to get reparations, which they're not going to get one. I can argue and I can almost guarantee you that it's not going to happen. If it is going to happen, it's going to be based on another set of program, which is inclusive of everyone. Okay. All right. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. So please give it a thumbs up, like the video, share the video, and subscribe to the channel. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye. Och det jag lägger av min tid och jag vill ha det. Nu får mig känna safety. Jag kan nog leda baby och jag kommer aldrig ändra mig.